My research into original sources of baseball history has revealed some interesting things about the early days of baseball. I wanted to share these with you guys, so I came up with a list of 5 of them. Number 1, team nicknames are really a modern invention. Baseball Reference is deceiving. Teams were not formally known by nicknames for huge swaths of baseball history. Nicknames were granted to teams by sports writers. Some nicknames were given for poetic or artistic reasons. Many of those nicknames faded away quickly. Sometimes a nickname came about because of a certain player or manager, for example, the Cleveland Naps or the Brooklyn Robins. And sometimes the stories behind nicknames that were passed down are not true. You can find examples of the American League team in Cleveland being called the Indians going back to 1901, or maybe even earlier. Number 2, the difference between Major and Minor League Baseball was not as clear-cut as you think. The formal difference was in the minor league draft, which was part of the many variations of the old national agreement. I'm still a little bit fuzzy on the details, but as I understand it, the draft allowed major league teams to formally draft minor league players at the end of the season. If you encounter a minor league team that was actually exempt from that draft, you're looking at a league that basically had major league status. The International League was famously exempt from that draft for years. In fact, Jack Dunn likely decided to sell Lefty Grove because he faced the possibility of losing him for under $5,000 in the draft anyway. Now, I personally wish that there was never any draft. I prefer the European system in which teams are completely independent and have to pay full price for the players they want to sign and then talk salary with them. The draft does not make sense to me. And yeah, I grew up watching the NFL and NBA drafts just like the rest of you. Number 3, day games started in the late afternoon. I'm planning on doing a much deeper dive into this. However, this is so obviously true that I really need to point it out. Deadball era games usually started at 3:30 p.m. local time or later. And yes, that meant crazy shadows on the playing field, giving the pitchers a huge advantage. In New York City, games started at 4 p.m. or sometimes even as late as 4:30. The reason is obvious. These teams were not running charities. They needed paying customers, and if the customers were at work, they needed to wait until work was done to start the games. Want to know why Christy Mathewson was so dominant in 1908? His opponents looked into a sea of white shirts when he pitched, and had to deal with the ball coming out from the sunny side of the field into the shadows. Want to know why they played so quickly? There were no lights in those days, and teams sometimes had barely 2 hours of sunlight to work with. If you were to go back in time 120 years and attend a baseball game, you would notice the late starting times and the shadows more than anything else. And in that, I include obvious things like the lack of batting helmets and guys leaving their gloves out on the field. Number 4, the players have fascinating stories. These guys were more than just numbers. They were real human beings just like you and me. And their stories are really interesting. I've never found a Major League Baseball player who wasn't a superb athlete. Many of these men were standout youth athletes when they were in high school. Many of them were prominently featured in local newspapers. This includes players who were awful in the majors. So be careful before you criticize these guys too much. In fact, instead of laying down criticism, you would really be better off spending some time researching their lives. You just might learn something. Number 5, the game itself has not changed. I've mentioned this before, I'll mention it again, and I'll continue to take heat in the comment section. The game of baseball has remained essentially unchanged since 1893. What have been the major developments in the sport in the last 130 years? Well, there aren't many of them. There was the infield fly rule in 1895. The foul strike rule in 1901 came about in the National League and then in 1903 in the American League. Now this was really controversial when it came up. That's the one that says a foul ball counts as a strike unless you've already got 2 strikes. Then in 1920, banning the spitball and other so-called freak pitches. Never mind the fact, of course, that pitchers continued to secretly use them for decades and probably still use them today. Then there was the famous designated hitter rule in 1973, which, as many of you know, or should know, was under consideration as far back as the 1920s. I think it's a travesty, but so it is. And then there are the more recent rule changes, like ghost runners and extra innings, banning the shift, the pitch clock, and so on. Now, none of these are major developments. This is nothing like, say, legalizing forward passing in hockey or allowing unlimited substitution in football. This isn't like the complete overhaul of the offside law in soccer in the 1920s. Baseball does not have anything like that. That is why the sport has had such a rich history, and that's why guys like me spend so much time comparing teams and talking about the great old stories. Of course, that's also why people complain that the sport is antiquated and slow. The truth is that it is the same game. If you went back to 1901 and watched a White Sox-Orioles game in Baltimore, you would recognize it as baseball right away. On the other hand, if you went back to 1901 and watched Michigan play football at Ohio State, you would be utterly confused. Well, and there you have it. You know, the more that I read, the more I realize that things I took for granted in the past are not necessarily true. The history of baseball is much more interesting and much more varied than you'd think.